Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where those videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. And if you've not already done so, please silence your phone. July 2nd is the birthday of Medgar Evers, and at 10:30 a.m. and 2 p.m. on that day, we'll offer museum tours to guests focusing on his life and legacy. Join us for those. The following week, on Thursday, July 11th at 5 p.m., we'll have History Happy Hour, commemorating Freedom Summer with free admission to the museums, complimentary appetizers from the Nissan Cafe by Nick Wallace, a cash bar, and live music. Guests can also join interactive flash tours through the museums to learn about the impact of Freedom Summer on the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. So come back for that. And then mark your calendars for Saturday, July 13th, and bring your photographs and learn how to preserve them during our Community Curation Day next door at the Winter Building. We'll give away archival materials that will help protect your photos, and while the program is free, space is limited. You can be sure to have a spot by making a reservation on the department's website or calling our main number. Finally, we'll have a big time on Sunday, July 14th, when we screen two short films, Ray Lum, Mule Trader, and OK, Mr. Ray. The original footage was shot by Bill Ferris. He'll be with us, as will OK, Mr. Ray director Ashley Meltzer, Ray Lum's grandniece Betsy Lipscomb, and Henry Harris, a descendant of Mule Trader Squire Harris, who's featured in the footage. And then I hope you'll come back next week for History's Lunch, when we'll be joined by Boyce Upholt to discuss his new book, The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi. Today, I'm delighted to have Joseph McGill to present Sleeping with the Ancestors in Mississippi. Joseph McGill is a former field officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where he worked to revitalize the Sweet Auburn Commercial District in Atlanta and to develop a management plan for the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area. He is a former executive director of the African American Museum in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and a former director of history and culture at Penn Center, St. Helena Island, South Carolina. McGill has also served as a National Park Service park ranger at Fort Sumter National Monument in Charleston. An Air Force veteran, McGill earned his BA in Professional English from South Carolina State University. He is the co-author of the book, Sleeping with the Ancestors, How I Followed the Footprints of Slavery. Help me welcome Joseph McGill.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be before you today. I want to talk about sleeping with the ancestors, how I followed the footprints of slavery, but I want to also talk about why I do what I do. The Slave Dwelling Project, History for Lunch, the Slave Dwelling Project, and Mississippi. So I do this thing because of the way that I was educated. If you can read what's on the screen there, that's from a history book. It's from a Virginia history book. It's about the treatment of enslaved people by enslaving Virginians. And that's how it was interpreted and taught to the youth of Virginia. I'm from South Carolina, the state that upon the election of Abraham Lincoln took their ball and went home. They had enough. So I was educated similarly in the state of South Carolina. I graduated in 1979. As I look over this audience, I see that some of you are about my age, maybe older, some younger. So I would wager that the education I got was similar to the education you got. That education taught me that my enslaved ancestors were happy to be enslaved, and their enslavers were benevolent people. None of that was true. But I had to find out the hard way that it was not true. So, you see that picture there on the left? I'm in there. We're at an historic site. We're at that site where it was proclaimed the gentleman who was president at the time of the Constitution. You know, we the people. Well, we were at that site with those tools, we were building a slave dwelling, log cabin, which would have been historically on the property of President James Madison, we the people, which stresses the fact that it should have read, we the people, comma, in this room. Because if you weren't in that room, that phrase really meant nothing to you. And that same phrase, we the people, that same Constitution, had to be amended to include me. And as I look at the African American females in this audience, it had to be amended many times over to include you. None of that stuff was taught to me in high school. So I started the slave dwelling project. Now, it came about kind of awkwardly because I was an employee at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, an organization known for preserving buildings. But these buildings that are preserved by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, or any historical organization preserving buildings, when they came into being initially, their thoughts were not concerning folks of my DNA. They were about telling the stories that kept them in a comfortable place. And that story that kept them in that comfortable place didn't talk about the ancestors, their ancestors being enslavers. Or if they talked about their ancestors being enslavers, they were the ones that were good to their enslaved people. Well, knowing that that was not true, being a researcher that I had to be a park ranger at Fort Sumter, knowing that being a park ranger at Fort Sumter, I was going to be standing in front of audiences, and I would be challenged. They would want to know how I felt as an individual, black man, telling the stories about the Civil War and how it started. Because my version of why it was different from most of the people who were asking me the question. So, I started the slave dwelling project because of those shortcomings, those misgivings, and I thought that, working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, there is a way, there is a desire to preserve buildings. So the formula is there. It was there already. All my task was to help people notice what was on the periphery, because when people go to these sites, for what the reasons that they go to these sites for, they sometimes see the slave dwellings, but they're not interested. They're not interested in that. They want to see the historical significance, the architectural significance of the building, the place settings, the nice vaulted ceilings, all that. They're interested in that. So when I started the slave dwelling project back in 2010, I called it the Slave Cabin Project, because in my mind, slavery was in a plantation in the South. I was missing a whole lot in thinking that way. That's why I call it the Slave Cabin Project initially. Well, luckily for me, when I was working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, I was assigned to the states of Alabama and Louisiana. So I went to Alabama to do my duties. But because I had started the Slave Dwelling Project, someone in Alabama, one of my contacts said, well, why don't you just add an extra day? I can find some slave dwellings for you to spend the night. And they did. Well, one of the places that they found was on the Alabama rivers called Riverside. So I went there and did what I needed to do. But then I went to this place. This is old Alabama town in Montgomery, Alabama. And I stayed in that place. Well, what I noticed about that place was it was 2 stories high, it was brick, and it had 4 compartments in it. That was not a cabin. So I had to change the name to the Slave Dwelling Project, because the Slave Dwelling Project is all-encompassing. And you'll understand that by the end of this presentation. But let me speak a little bit about that right now, because that does not look like a place where an enslaved person would have stayed historically. And what I found out was this. A lot of people who are in a position to create such a space for the public to consume, they suffered from what I suffered from. That is, they were taught that slavery was this. And going into this place kind of softens that institution. So, but the point is, because I visited there, and because I visited there early enough in the process, I changed the name from the Slave Dwelling Project, from the Slave Cabin Project to the Slave Dwelling Project, because that's all encompassing. Because I found out that sometimes these places are saved by default. Because these enslaved people were not always living in a separate building. Sometimes they were living in the attic, sometimes they were living in the basement. So you, in your effort to save this nice, beautiful, architecturally significant building, you're also saving the places where our enslaved ancestors once dwelled. So I find myself sleeping in some of those places. Some of the places I go, slave dwellings aren't there anymore for whatever reason. There's Mother Nature. There's some people don't want them on the property because they have to pay taxes on them. They weren't made with the best material to start with. So those are some of the reasons they're not here anymore. One other reason they're not here anymore is the reason I do what I do. And that reason is some of those places aren't there anymore because people try to get rid of that part of history. So it's because of that the Slave Dwelling Project now exists and is prospering. Institutions of higher learning. What I learned in this journey that I'm on is that there are all kinds of categories of enslavement. There are all kinds of entities out there that was in on it. That's why it's an institution. They call it the peculiar institution. Yeah, quite peculiar because a lot of institutions of higher learning came into existence because of that institution of slavery. These are some of the places that are on the list that I've actually spent the night in slave dwellings on their property. Rowan Oak, Sweetbriar College, in Virginia. First place I stayed at an institution of higher learning. The creator of that particular site, that property, Sweetbriar Plantation, left Vermont as an abolitionist. Then he got to Virginia, became one of the biggest enslaver in that area. Rowan Oak College, I stayed on a property there. University of Virginia, our president, Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal. Well, he owned 600 people. And of course, there's the Sally Hemings story attached to all this, which was, they were in denial for a while with the Sally Hemings story until the DNA proved otherwise. Clemson University in my home state of South Carolina, my daughter graduated from there, undergraduate. And when my daughter and I and my wife, family, we were on the tour, the tours are nice. They try to convince the young mind that this is the place you want to be. Well, as I listened to that tour that they were giving her, I had to bite my tongue because I wasn't making the decision. It was her decision to make. They weren't telling her about, John C. Calhoun, who's got a mansion on that campus. They didn't tell them about his idea of the greater good and nullification and all. They weren't talking about all that. They weren't talking about Benjamin Tillman, who was one of the governors of South Carolina and one of the representatives of South Carolina. He earned the name, that's still there. He earned the name Benjamin Pitchfork Tillman. They weren't telling her all that. Furman University, I spent the night there. Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. The creator of Furman University, a Baptist minister, slave owner. College of Charleston, spent the night there. University of Mississippi, now, not on the campus. I spent the night at Rowan Oak, and that's the home of William Faulkner. Thank you. Yeah, him. So let me tell you a story about that, since we are in Mississippi. So I go to Holly Springs. I've been going to Holly Springs, Mississippi for years to sleep in slave dwellings there. Well, the first year I went there, I visited Rowan Oak. And the young curator there said, you know, what you're doing is a great idea. Maybe next year you should add a day to your schedule and you could spend the night here at Rowan Oak. I said, okay, let's do this. So I did it. I added a day. And a few days before I was supposed to go, I started getting these messages. And it turns out that that young curator was all for it. He understood. But at that time, at that moment, the University of Mississippi was not ready for this. They didn't want to go there. They wanted to keep the story about Mr. Faulkner. They didn't want to talk about the fact that the creator of that particular property, the Mr. Shagog, who came from Tennessee, was an enslaver. And as an enslaver, that's what he did. He enslaved people. But again, they were not ready for that. Now, I have gone back since. And I have stayed at Rowan Oak. And, you know, eventually when these folks see that what the Slave Dwelling Project's all about, see that I'm sincere about honoring the enslaved ancestors, they usually come around to the Slave Dwelling Project's way of thinking. It's all good for everyone. Now, the reason I put that photograph there is let's see if I can use this. So I'm pointing here on the screen, the lady right behind me there. Standing behind me. We're in the old governor's mansion in Baton Rouge. And she is a descendant of one of the enslaved people who was sold by Georgetown University so that Georgetown University could remain solvent. 272 people they sold for that purpose. And she is a descendant of one of those enslaved people sold. So, presidential sites. So, 12 of our former presidents were slave owners, 8 of whom owned slaves while they were in office. And I spent nights at these places. Now, it took me a while to get into these places because, you know, when these places came online, Mount Vernon, Monticello, Montpelier, the Hermitage, they're all plantations, but they're not called that. I used to work at a plantation up until the last day of last year. And Magnolia Plantation and Garden is where I worked. So people would often, I would often ask my audience, have you ever visited a plantation? And I asked, if this is your first time visiting a plantation, a lot of them would raise their hands. I said, well, wait a minute. That's a trick question. I'm going to ask you that same question another way. Then I'll ask, well, have you visited Mount Vernon, Monticello, Montpelier, the Hermitage? They raise their hands again. I said, that's the trick in the question. Somebody made it their business not to call these places plantation because they wanted to stay in that comfortable place. And calling it a plantation takes them away from that. So, slavery at Monticello. So another thing that we're doing right now is, in our evolution of just doing more than sleeping in these places, we have these conversations, these hard conversations before the sleepover. I call them slavery and the legacy that is left on this nation. And in these conversations, we talk about white supremacy, white privilege, Confederate monuments, weddings on plantations, the death of George Floyd, and of course now the elephant in the room, anti-CRT, anti-woke, DEI. We talk about all that stuff in the current conversations that we have. Now, you look at Monticello. Some of you may recall that maybe 4, 5 years ago, they got complaints because they were kind of transitioning into doing it the right way, meaning telling the stories of the enslaved people that were there, and people would come there and complain. I got someone in the audience, Olivia. She could testify to some of the complaints that she got as an employee at McLeod Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina. Some of the same complaints, because we're talking about the enslaved people who were on this property. They got upset. It got so upset it made the news. It made national news that people were mad because they were coming to Thomas Jefferson's place and learning about slavery. Slavery in northern states. See, that's another element that I totally missed, being educated in South Carolina. Because, as I said at the beginning, slavery in my mind was a plantation in a southern state. And because it was like that, I missed all that. Now, my very first sleepover in a northern state, that photograph there, that's Cliveden. Cliveden, as it's pronounced by some, Cliveden. It's in Philadelphia, Germantown. This particular slave owner was, of course, a slave owner, and he also had plantations in Maryland. So during the Civil War, he's kind of playing both sides of the issue. So that was my very first sleepover in the northern state. Delaware, I stayed at a place called Dickinson Plantation. So slavery was quite prominent in Delaware. Massachusetts, I stayed at a place, the Royal House and Slave Quarters. Isaac Royal Jr. was the largest enslaver in the state of Massachusetts. Part of his 500-acre plantation is now Tufts University. So I stayed there in Massachusetts. Minnesota. Where at in Minnesota, you may ask? Well, for all of you who are familiar with the Dred Scott case, one of the reasons Dred Scott brought his case to the Supreme Court was the fact that he was in the state of Minnesota, a free state. And because he was in the state of Minnesota, a free state, that was his justification for taking his case to the Supreme Court. Now, unfortunately, in 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that no black folks had any rights that any white folks had to honor. So that was the story there. That's why, and I stayed at Fort Snelling in that space where Dred Scott and his wife, Harriet, actually stayed. New Jersey. New Jersey, on paper, ended slavery in 1808. Was it 1804? One of those years. So New Jersey, on paper, ended it in slavery that year. But at the beginning of the Civil War, people were still enslaved in the state of New Jersey. New York. New York abolished slavery in 1799 on paper. But the last person freed in New York was 1827. In 1703, 40% of New Yorkers were slave owners. When South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th of 1860, New York considered seceding also because of its financial investment in the institution of slavery. Pennsylvania, I told you about my first sleepover there at Cliveden in West Virginia. I spent the night at Harper's Ferry. Equal justice. So I told you the Fort Snelling story. Dred Scott taking his case to the Supreme Court because he was in that free state of Minnesota. They went through some stuff recently because they wanted to add to the Fort Snelling name they wanted to name it for an Indian tribe that was there. They wanted to attach that to Fort Snelling and put that Indian name right at the end there. But they got pushback, and it didn't happen. Supreme Court justices. So I stayed at in Prince George's County, Maryland. I stayed at the home of Gabrielle Duval, and I stayed at the home of John Jay. Now that goes back to New York. John Jay was quite instrumental in ending slavery in the state of New York. But while he was advocating for the freedom of those enslaved people, he was also enslaving people. Virginia's governor's mansion. I stayed there about maybe 4 years ago. And the time I stayed there was the time of the governor. You know, the governor got in trouble with the blackface, you know. Remember that? So we got an invitation, and we stayed at the governor's mansion. We had a beautiful time staying at the governor's mansion. And I thought we were going back. When we left there, we thought we were going back. But then there was an election. And the current administration is not buying what we're selling. So, you know, we'll see. We'll see where it goes. And Bacon's Castle in Virginia. Hey, if you want to put a placeholder on racism and how it's actually latched on to what we call our civilization here, look at Bacon's Castle and what went on there. You know, the have-nots all got together. You know, the indentured servants and the enslaved population, the black folks of that period got together and went against the establishment. And they started this Bacon's Castle revolt. So look at Bacon's Castle and study the details of what went on there. Fort Monroe, you know, 1619. Those are triggering words to some. You know, 1619, when it became a thing, when it became a book, it was a lot of pushback against that. I had a night, spent the night at Fort Monroe, because it was there at Fort Monroe, in that general area, where those enslaved people were, that has caused so much controversy as to incorporating the stories of African Americans into the history of this nation. So yeah, Fort Monroe was that. And we just commemorated Juneteenth. If we think about Juneteenth and its origins, we got to look at what went on at Fort Monroe, because at the beginning of that Civil War, folks would go into Fort Monroe, and formerly enslaved people would take refuge in Fort Monroe. And the commander of that particular fort was not familiar with what to do. I mean, this was all new. Well, what he decided to do was to hold on to those enslaved people, because sending them back to their enslavers would provide to the Confederate Army resources. And those enslavers were renting these people out to the Confederate Army. And these people were doing things to support the Confederate cause. So he started holding on to these folks and labeled them as contraband. And so we can look at that moment and move forward to June 19th of 1865, because federal forces, the Emancipation Proclamation meant nothing to the enslaved if there aren't federal forces anywhere around to enforce the provisions of the Emancipation Proclamation. That did not happen in Galveston, Texas until June 19th of 1865. And that's why we celebrate Juneteenth. So what does this all have to do with Mississippi? It's got a lot to do with Mississippi, because I spent nights in a lot of places in Mississippi. Holly Springs, great example. So very early on in the process of the slave dwelling project, there was a co-worker of mine, Jennifer Eggleston, married to Carter, Julius Carter is his name. They owned property in Holly Springs. They had just acquired that property. I was about a year into what I was doing. They thought that what they were doing and what I was doing could work together, because what they were doing was creating a tour. They called it Behind the Big House tour. Well, the intent was to go beyond what the Garden Club did in Holly Springs. And the Garden Club is pretty powerful in this state. So they wanted to supplement what the Garden Club was doing, because the Garden Clubs, they had their pilgrimages. and they were focusing on the nice, beautiful big house. Well, enter Joseph McGill in the slave dwelling project. Well, in addition to what you're going to be doing, showing your public that's been coming here to see what you've been showing them for all these years, we're going to put an addendum on it. We're going to go beyond the back door of the big house, and we're going to talk about these slave dwellings back here. And we did. And we did it well. We did it so well that one lady, Linda Turner is her name, I saw her in the audience, and she was an African-American female. She was just checking us out because she wanted to know if we were real. She wanted to know if we were beyond just this nice, beautiful big house story that's been always been told. And when she saw that we were real, then she put forth her time and effort to make sure that next year we did it, there were going to be a good representation of school children. And it happened. And it's still happening. My longest tenure going to any place out of the state of South Carolina has been Holly Springs, Mississippi, to do exactly what the slave dwelling project was designed to do. Bring attention to the fact that these slave dwellings exist, but not only should they exist, the stories of the people who inhabited those spaces should be incorporated into the narrative. So, Holly Springs takes credit for that. And I went there just April of this year. I think there's a slide a little later on that'll give some more information on that. Now, I told you about the University of Mississippi story already and how that, how that went down. And that relationship with the University of Mississippi is still strong. We're still doing this thing. In fact, I was there a few months ago because of the book, because of the new book, and they had a book festival, and the book was one of the books featured. Jefferson County, Prospect Hill. So I was trying very hard to get into Natchez. Very tough nut to crack. You know, I talked about the garden clubs, right? You guys know the power of garden clubs. They do their pilgrimages every year. And I was trying my best. Every time I thought I was in, they would retract. They would take me so far and rescind the offer. So then I met Jessica Crawford. And again, I got a slide coming up that will give more details of how that went down. But Prospect Hill in Jefferson County was the place that I got to spend the night through Jessica Crawford. Jessica Crawford, before that happened, we were in South Carolina, we and others, of course. We slept on that replica ship that came into South Carolina in the year 1670, and it brought the colonizers there that purged natives and made South Carolina a state. So, yeah, Jessica Crawford helped with that. Then there's Natchez. We did indeed get the Natchez through the National Park Service, through the preservation organization there. I've gone there, I've slept in a few places. One place that I slept was Concord Quarters, and I put that on there because it's owned by someone who shares my DNA. Lately, you may see more and more of black folks acquiring these properties and interpreting them in a manner that they should be interpreted. You may have seen on the news Sharswood in Virginia, where this gentleman acquired property, a plantation, because they were looking for a place to have a family reunion, and doing the research, they found out that their family were indeed enslaved at that property. I want to spend the night there. It hasn't happened yet, but I think it will. National Park Service in Natchez, we've got a good relationship with them. Now, Columbus, different story. So now, and I did stay in a place in Columbus. They do their pilgrimages, and I got the invitation to come and spend the night, and I did. I didn't get an invitation to come back. I think could have been a one and done, but I haven't given up hope because I got this call from the library system in Columbus. And she said she's interested in bringing me back because, the book and might be an opportunity to talk to an audience. Now, this was a few months ago because here's the thing. They have these good ideas. Folks at a certain level in management of the place, they know it's a good idea. They feel it, but they have somebody to answer to. And those people that they have to answer to may not be there yet, may not want to get there. And so therefore, they make the decisions as to who and what will interact at these places. There it is, behind the big house. And that's what we did there April 4th, 5th, and 6th of this year. Man, we had children just filing through the places. And in the place I go, the craft house is under new management now. I told you about the initial couple who purchased the place. Well, it's under new, they sold it. But the folks who bought it are just as preservation-minded as they were. That's why I came again this year. And that's why we're now talking about me coming again in 2025, because we have established this thing. We've got these children flowing through the space and learning about slavery, the real story of slavery. So one year, I was there, and a group of young kids came through, private school, of young kids and young ladies. One of the young ladies asked me the question. She said, "Do you know anyone who are descendants of enslaved people and you interact with them?" She said, "Do you know anyone who are descendants of enslaved people?" So I was about to answer the question. Because I know a lot of folks. It's like I'm like a sounding board for them. I'm like a social worker for that. They just attract themselves to me. So she asked that part of the question, but then she put an addendum on the end. She said, "Who are proud of the fact that their ancestors enslaved people." She made me think. I said, "No, I don't know anybody like that. At least they don't express that to me, if there are such people out there." So these are the moments that are created by what we've done in Holly Springs. So we need to keep that up. More behind the big house, Holly Springs. Hey, I'm in that photograph there to the right. You can. It's like Find Waldo. I'm in there. Yeah. So once upon a time, they used to. I think the wearing of the hoop skirt was much more prominent than it is now. Because I know the last few times that I went there, we were just focusing on the school kids and not the queen or the king and all that stuff. We were just focusing on the opportunity to tell kids about the slavery that existed in these places. There's Jessica. She is the one who got me the sleepover at Prospect Hill Concord Quarters. You see there to the right, some of you may know Sesesh Sir Boxley, who is quite influential in the African American world of telling real stories of our enslaved ancestors. My wish list. We're already talking about me coming back to behind that big house in Holly Springs in 2025. My relationship with the University of Mississippi is still going strong. We'll be doing more things there. I talked about Columbus, the library deal that could happen, quite possibly could happen. There's Natchez. We want to do more in Natchez. We want to work with the Garden Club if they want to work with us. But I think there's opportunity there if indeed they just sit down at the table and talk to us. We can really do some things. There's Vicksburg. Vicksburg almost happened on this trip here. If maybe I would have planned a little better, maybe I could have stayed in a slave dwelling in Vicksburg last night, but I'll do better next time when I come here, because almost happened. Beauvoir, if I pronounced that correctly. That's going to be the biggest challenge. You know, I stayed at Fort Monroe. They wouldn't let me stay where, Jefferson Davis was held as a prisoner. I wanted to sleep there. They wouldn't let me. I gave a presentation at the White House in Richmond. I didn't sleep there, but I gave a presentation similar to what I'm doing right now. I want to also sleep in the place in Alabama, which was one of the places where Jefferson Davis, stayed and performed was a part of the capital of the Confederacy. So I want to do these things, not for spite. I want to do it because it's an opportunity to tell the stories of the enslaved people who inhabited those spaces. So I know some of you've got connections. Some of you might like to see it happen. And some of you, if you have those connections, if you want it to happen, let's make it happen. Because, as I said, it's more than sleeping. It's the opportunity to have these conversations around these campfires about slavery and the legacy that is left on this nation. So if you want to talk to me after and talk about those possibilities of us going to Beauvoir and spending a night and doing it right, let's have that conversation. All right, the illusions of freedom, slavery in northern states. Our conference, 2024 conference. We've done 7 conferences so far to date, and they've all been in southern states. Well, we're going up north this time because we're going to talk about the fact that even after the revolution, people who were formerly enslaved in those northern states became free legislatively. It didn't take a civil war. It didn't take the 13th Amendment to free these people. These states did it legislatively, but they were still complicit. Complicit in the fact that the insurance companies putting insurance on these enslaved people were in those northern states. The banks holding mortgages on those enslaved people were in those northern states. The ships being built and those ship owners were in those northern states. Those factories adding value to the cotton were in those northern states. So that's what we're going to talk about. They're not going to get a pass. We're going to put them out there. And facts over feelings. Guys, I live in Berkeley County, South Carolina. And about 3 weeks ago, they hit us with the news that AP history, as it pertains to black history, is no longer relevant. They're going to rid themselves of that. Facts over feelings. History should be about facts, not feelings. We get these things being legislated that the teachers can't teach this element of our history because feelings get hurt. Hey, I wish they would have been around when I was learning about my enslaved ancestors being happy and the people who enslaved them being good people. Where were they then? But the point is, it's facts over feeling. Let's talk about the harshness of this. And let's eliminate the desire to want to erase this element of our history. Yes, and there's the book. For those of you who might be interested, I think there's a salesperson over there that's ready for that. And looking at the time. All right, I think this is the last slide. Mississippi became a state in 1817. See, what was happening in this territory during the colonial era? Now, I end with this because we have an opportunity here as a nation. Now, 2026 will be the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. In 1776 was the 200th anniversary of the American Revolution. We celebrated, as we should have. But this has got to be more than a celebration, guys. We got to make sure that the voices of the enslaved people were there. Something was going on in this area during the colonial period in our history. We were purging natives. I know that applies to this territory as it existed as a territory. We need to tell that story, you know, and there were black folks who were here in this state as a part of the time before this became a state. We got to tell that story. And 2026 is going to give us that opportunity. I'm almost certain that's the last slide. So we're back to that, and I'm going to open it up for questions.
If you have a question, you can raise your hand, bring the microphone to you.
Hi, I was just wondering, when you stay at places the night, what do you do besides sleep there? I know there's more than that, and how does that fit in as a process of maybe an analytical process or whatever you're using to, go about doing the project and things of that nature? Why stay a night at these places?
To accomplish exactly what the project is accomplishing, bringing attention to the place, the fact that the place exists, and the fact that because it exists, it gives us that opportunity to tell the real stories of those places. We need to arrest that opportunity that people have of getting rid of these places so that they can eliminate that part of the story. I think that now the slave dwelling project has become a clearinghouse. I get these phone calls from people who say, well, I got this slave dwelling on this property, and I came across your information. It's deteriorating, it's falling down. Who should I call? And sometimes I can help them with that. I direct them to the people who can help them. So it's just that. It's about bringing attention to these places, letting people know not only should they exist, the stories of the people who inhabited them should also be told.
It's very interesting. My question is one that I'm trying to work out. Last week's speaker showed a map of enslaved people in northern states, and then I looked up when some of the states actually freed their people, and it was after June 19th. So what made it so significant that Galveston became the place that celebrated? I know what it says, but if there were other states still holding people enslaved, then what made Galveston special?
Because of the forces that went in with them. Granger and his forces, which also included black soldiers. Now, again, there might be some outliers out there where in places where soldiers weren't. I mean, they may have gotten the word. These plantation owners may have gotten the word, but were they anxious to tell these folks that they were free? They wanted to get in this last crop, at least one more crop, before these folks were knowledgeable of the fact that they were indeed free. And even beyond that, even beyond 1865, you can find cases where people were still not of that knowledge, enslaved people were still not of that knowledge, they were free. So even beyond Juneteenth, there was still those sporadic cases of people still enslaved, but that was based on the fact that the federal forces weren't there to enforce it. of course, we know that after 1865, we're not dealing with the Reconstruction. And, the Reconstruction is about making sure that these federal forces are in these places to enforce all the federal government had to offer. But, that went on until 1877, and when the federal forces were taken out of the South because of that compromise that went on. So, I hope that helped.
Yes. You're aware that the author of our national anthem was a slave owner, right?
Francis Scott Key. Yeah.
And maybe we should then sing "The Land of the Free White Men and the Home of the Slaves."
Yeah. And, hey, check it out. We got an opportunity. You know that bridge that got knocked down? That they got to replace? Why name it after an enslaver? Put another name on it.
This isn't a very academic question, but I'm curious, considering all the places you've been and the dark history behind it, have you seen any ghosts?
Well, I don't know what they look like, smell like, sound like. So the short answer is no. So check it out. So when I first started in 2010, I used to get these phone calls from these ghost hunting outfits, the TV shows, because they were a lot more prominent back then. I had to shoot them away. Because that's not what this project's about. It's about honoring the enslaved ancestors. Now, some people ask that question differently. Do you feel the spirit of the ancestors? Because I separate ghosts and spirits. I think those are two different things. I don't look for that either, because I think what I'm doing is burdensome. And if communing with the ancestors was possible, I wouldn't want to. Although I know their intentions toward me would be favorable, my intention toward them is always favorable. But I don't want to conjure any, I don't want to disturb any of that. So I just deal with what I can control, the physical. I know that there's a physical space that I need access to so that I can do what I do, and I just leave it at that. Now, there are some who come and join me who want to feel those things as spiritually. Now, if they're looking for ghosts, you got to go away too. But if they want to feel those things spiritually, I don't discourage that. I let them come and have the opportunity to feel those things.
Get your question in just a second. We've got a few comments and a question from the live stream. First, Edith O'Quinn says she's watching. She's from Jefferson County, Mississippi, and a descendant of Isaac Ross. The old Alabama town, Alabama, thanks you for mentioning the old Alabama town. Says we've learned so much on our journey with you and invite everyone to visit us. And Laura Franey says the Melrose Plantation in Natchez has an interesting exhibit this month on the enslaved population.
Melrose, National Park Service. Yeah.
Your presentation was really good. And I understand that you're really trying to get out more education on these places. But what are your deep down feelings when you sleep in these places that have been owned by slave owners?
Well, initially, I questioned myself because other folks questioned me, my intent, and rightfully so. It was that very first night I slept in a slave dwelling at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens all by myself. It took a while for me to get to sleep because there's a large oak tree right by the cabin that I slept in. And every time the wind blew, the limb from that oak tree interacted with the roof. And I had to get up about 5 times to verify that's what it was. But when I laid down that 5th time, I started thinking about, enslaved people in that space. Because the next day was Mother's Day in 2010 when I would wake up. And I thought about moms giving birth to children who, by nature, biologically, those children are theirs. But the laws of that period said, no, that's chattel. That belongs to me. You belong to me, that belongs to me, and any offspring that child might have belongs to me. And I thought about the labor that these enslaved people were performing and the fact that they could not benefit from it, but their enslavers could. And I thought about those who thought about running away and the fact that, there were bloodhounds on all of these properties trained just for that purpose of catching them when they ran away. Now, presently, I don't feel those things anymore. I don't have those questions anymore because I don't sleep in these places alone anymore. I'm usually there with someone else. And there was a point early on in the process in Texas where I had to make a decision because up until that point, the only people joining me in that space were black folks. But then I got asked by my host, one of the team members was white. He asked me, could he spend the night in the space with me? And I thought about it a little while. I said yes eventually. I'm glad I said yes because otherwise we're just preaching to the choir if it's just us. So now I don't sleep alone anymore. And for me, it's just routine. I just go and I do it. Now, leading up to COVID, people were, standing in line, waiting for their opportunity to, share this space in this time with me, and they did. Now that COVID is less of an issue, still an issue, but less of an issue, we still, vet people and let them come and spend these nights with us. Now, I do less sleepovers now because of the way we have evolved, because the conversation now is much more important than the sleepover itself. And we do a lot more conversations. In fact, we're going to take the conversations to another level also because of the political climate. These conversations need to be held at more places than just these antebellum sites. I had a call just last week from Arkansas, Little Rock, Arkansas, Little Rock 9, the school integration. They want to bring this conversation there, the content of the conversation there. It may or may not include a sleepover. I don't know. But the conversations now are much more important than the sleepovers. But for me personally, it's nothing to it. It's just sleep.
Thank you for the work and for talking about it. Are there sites other than the one I know of, the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, that are antebellum former enslaving sites that are being curated and represented really primarily and exclusively now from the point of view of the enslaved people who were forced to serve there? And if there aren't, are there any in the works, I hope?
Can I yield a minute to Olivia, would you? I know I put you on the spot, but I want to yield to you. The microphone.
McLeod Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina, where I worked, where I had the honor of meeting Joe McGill, tells the story fully from the enslaved perspective. I had the honor to give a tour about the enslaved woman's perspective and the trauma and resilience that they faced and gave. And it was quite an experience, as he referenced earlier. We got a lot of pushback, but it was all well worth it. And so go to McLeod Plantation, James Island, South Carolina, and then scoot on over to St. Helena Island down in Beaufort.
You mentioned that when you were talking to your white friend and he wanted to have a sleepover. He wanted to experience that, and you thought about it. And then you said, if we don't do that, it's like preaching to the choir. Then I was wondering, have you thought, or is there a place Or is commercialization of this experience not something that's distasteful? I mean, is it something that you don't see like an Airbnb experience or whatever? Is it just, is there an opportunity, or do you think there should be, where we should experience that if we want to? What's your thought on that?
Yeah.
The commercialization of it.
Commercialization, that's kind of tricky, because I'm against weddings on plantations. I think that's a commercialization of those spaces. You know, most white folks I talk to have no problems with it. Most of the black folks I've talked to do. So that's one form. I was fortunate about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weekends ago. I slept on the Amistad. The Amistad, for those of you who know the story, or who don't know the story, that ship back in 1839 was commandeered by the enslaved people on board. And there was a movie made about it, about that particular ship. And the crew, there's a replica that we slept on. And the crew, all white crew, cornered me. And they said, and they asked the question you asked. They said, well, how do you feel about this ship being used in the manner that it's being used? I said, from where I sit, from what I see, the way that it's being used, I think it's fine, it's good. Because we had so much taken away from us. You know, slave dwellings not on the landscape anymore. It's very hard to find these slave dwellings, ships, even as wreckage. The Clotilda is a good example of that search. So I think any opportunity that we get to get people together, if it's for the purpose of sleeping in these spaces and having these conversations, I think we should stress more the conversations and not so much the sleepover. So I think that any opportunity that we have to get folks in these situations, to have these opportunities at these sites, I think it's a good thing. I don't call it commercialization. I call it an opportunity to have real conversations at these historic sites, because these historic sites are disarming. You know, you'll be surprised at some of the things I hear around these campfires. Examples, if you got time. All right. So there we were at Magnolia Plantation, have this conversation about slavery and the legacy that is left on this nation. Very near the end, this one young lady talks about the fact that she's black. And she talked about the fact that, no, I'm sorry, I got it all wrong. She's white. She talked about the fact that her father and her had a terrible relationship because her father slapped her because she had admired a black man. And she said she had to deal with that because her father was on his way out. I mean, he had Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. And she was contemplating, should she restore the relationship with her father? Another conversation that I had in Virginia was a young lady talked about her brother. She said her brother is showing some of the same signs of being radical as Dylan Roof was showing prior to him going into that church in Charleston and taking out 9 lives. Now, I haven't read anything since that conversation about somebody in that area doing something like that. But those are the things, the kind of conversations that we had. We had another conversation at Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson. We've got there the descendants of Sally Hemings and others who were enslaved there. And there's an element of that group who wants to think that that was a consensual relationship. And then there are the others. I had to get physically between them, those two, to keep them from coming to blows. Another situation in New Orleans. So there's alcohol involved, just know that. So we're having this conversation, and we're talking about free labor. And this white gentleman about my age, because we were discussing free labor as the fact that these people weren't paid. So he said, wait a minute, they kind of were, because the enslaver were housing them, clothing them, and feeding them. He was right. Everything he said was right, but his timing was bad. And I, again, had to, get in between them. So these opportunities that we give, the Slave Dwelling Project does, is that. It's not commercializing anything. We don't charge people to come and take part in these conversations. They just got to come and be ready to have these conversations. So that's what we do. Now, Airbnb is another subject because I had to, when this thing came up, TikTok. This one gentleman saw this Airbnb being advertised, and he put them on Front Street on TikTok. And Airbnb called me. They said, "You see what's going on. You got any recommendations for us?" And I gave my recommendations. They implemented them. Next time I'm gonna charge them. All right, so I hope that helped.
What were your recommendations to Airbnb?
That don't advertise them as some place as for frivolity or frolicking, or don't tell people that come experience that period in time by sleeping here. Now, if you're going to use it for a rental space, just use it for that, because a lot of people use it for those things. Very first, 14 years ago when I started, I was so adamant about the places being pristine because I work for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We were all into the Secretary of Interior standards for doing things. If you acquire this property, you shouldn't do this. If you're going to preserve it, you shouldn't do this. You need to do that. Well, there was a situation in Missouri where a lady acquired the property, and we got in her ear telling what she should and should not do. Well, she got so frustrated with us that under the cover of darkness, she tore it down. So we had to break away away from that, because all I want to do now is have the places exist. And in that existence, we have that opportunity to tell that stories. Now, there are some extremes out there that I wouldn't do with a slave dwelling, such as at Appomattox. They use them as restrooms. I wouldn't do that. I'd discourage that kind of stuff. So, there.
We have copies of Sleeping with the Ancestors for sale over here. And if anybody has any questions that we didn't get a chance to get to, I'm sure Mr. McGill will be glad to talk to you and answer those. Thank you all for being here. Remember all the things that we have coming up. Come back next week when we'll have Boyce Uphold talking about his new book on Mississippi River. For now, help me thank Joseph McGill for this fantastic program.